Hello, this is Kyra. In this video, we're going to be going over the contracted group quote. This is part of my groups training series. This is part 3. In this video, we're going to be talking about the process of getting a quote for a group that you want to contract, okay? So this is specifically about contracted groups and the process from when you have a client or a group leader who wants to have a group to the point where you can deliver the quote for the group contract to them. So let's start with step 1. You've got to narrow down the hotel or cruise choices, okay? Very important. It's the first step is to come up with those top choices. And I want to say that when it comes to research, there really is no difference between your FIT individual clients and a group client. You're going to do your research in the same way that you are for all of your clients. It's a very similar process in the research stage. So research, very important. So you're going to go with our vendors and search for hotels, resorts, cruises, whatever the client is looking for, just like you would for that individual client, okay? You're going to go to the vendor, you're going to search for properties or cruises that you think fit their needs. And then you need to narrow it down. This is very important. You've got to know the destination and you've got to know the dates. Just like with any client, you need to know this information and you need to narrow it down. If you have a client that wants to go to an all-inclusive resort but is stuck between multiple destinations, this is when you help them narrow it down to the top destination, just like you would any of your other clients. Now, also, what is the reasonable cost per person? This is really important to know. It's going to help you in the research phase. How much is the average person willing to spend with this group, okay? Most of the time you would have some sort of idea what the reasonable cost is. I think the client probably knows if $2,000 is reasonable or if $5,000 is reasonable, right? Every client in the group may go with a different room category and spend a different amount of money, but we definitely need to know what the ballpark range is and what's way out there. They may not want $5,000 a person. That might be just too much, and that's something that you need to know prior to doing the research. So price it out. You've narrowed it down. You know the dates, you know the destination, you know the cruise line. What is the FIT or individual price for several different room types at that hotel, resort, and cruise? So you're going to go into our vendors, do your research, and find the price of several room categories or cabin categories, and add an upcharge of 10% to that price, okay? So like we talked about in one of the prior videos, that the group price may not be less than the individual price. It may be more. So I recommend an upcharge of 10% because we'd rather give the client something that's a little too high than something that's too low. So look at that pricing just like you are for your clients. You're going to go to the vendor, you're going to price out that hotel, that cruise, and you're going to add an upcharge of 10% to several room types. Give them a range, right? Give them the interior and the balcony, or give them the garden view and the ocean view so that they have an idea of the range of the price, and send this price to the group leader with the option as a quick quote. Okay, this is a quote that you are going to create. It's not going to be an official quote from the vendor, but it is something you can do to help narrow it down, right? They're going to have a general idea of how much that option is going to cost, and that can help that group leader narrow it down. So you're going to work with that group leader back and forth until you've narrowed it down to the top 1 to 2 options. The vendors are not going to give you group quotes for 5 options. That's where your research and your quick quotes come into play, because you've already narrowed it down by giving the client general pricing and the information for some of their options. You could go back and forth many times. If it's a destination wedding and they are getting married at that property, it's going to matter a lot to them where they're staying. You know, a family reunion may be easier. Maybe it's not as much back and forth. Maybe they're not as picky. Maybe it doesn't have to be the perfect place, but you're going to work back and forth with that group leader, and you do need to narrow it down to 1 to 2 options maximum, okay? I can't stress that enough. They are not going to give you 5 quotes. They're not going to give you 10 quotes. Okay, that's what your quick quotes are for, to help the client narrow it down. So we've narrowed it down. We have 1 or 2 options. Our next step is to request the official group quote. So how do we go about doing this? Before you can request the group quote, you need all of this information. Hopefully you have most of this in the research phase. You should have a majority of this information already. You need to know who your group leader is, right? Who's the Pied Piper? Who's the person who's going to make this group happen? They're going to want to know that person's name. What is the occasion and what is the group type? Is it a corporate group? Is it a family reunion or a social group? They're going to want to know that, as well as the travel dates. What is the approximate range? If you're talking about a hotel or a resort, not everyone is going to stay the same nights. Some people may stay more nights, some people may stay less nights, but you need that approximate date range. Or when it comes to a cruise, of course, the specific cruise that you are looking at, the specific ship and sailing date. The approximate number of travelers. Now, this is a quote. This is not a contract, so this can change, and it will probably change, but you need to have a general idea of how many people are coming. You can get this information from the group leader, and the approximate number of rooms or cabins that are going to be needed. This can affect what quote comes back to you. If you have, 10 rooms, it may be a very different quote than if you have 60 rooms. So keep that in mind. They want a general idea of how many travelers and how many rooms and cabins you're going to need. And then, of course, your 1 or 2 top choices that they are going to create a quote for. Next, you're going to actually contact the group department and request the quote, providing all of the information we just talked about. Now, our vendors offer usually 3 different ways you can do this: online, over the phone, or via email. Now, I highly recommend online and over the phone. I don't personally recommend that you do this via email. It is the slowest form of communication, but online and over the phone is great. If they offer online, what I would recommend is you provide the information online, and then you call them and let them know that they sent it in, and you're going to want to know what the timeline is on getting that quote back to you. Okay, so I definitely prefer online, and it's always great to talk to them on the phone as well. Email may be an option available to you as well. And once they've generated that group quote for your group, they're usually going to send it to you via email. So keep an eye out on your emails, because that's most likely how they are going to send it to you. Now, I do have one other point here. Most of the time, you cannot create a group quote on your own. Some of our vendors do allow you to do groups on your own, okay? Some vendors do have that option. If they have that option, go for it. But most of the time, you do not have this option, and you are going to have to contact the group department. This is something very different from our FIT and individual reservations, where we may not be talking to the group or to the vendor for every person who's traveling. But in this case, with groups, talking to the vendor, calling them on the phone, that is something you are going to be doing. So please expect that you are going to have to call them, because it's going to happen. Now, the turnaround times, okay? Always expect 5 business days, sometimes even longer, to create quotes, okay, from the group department. It can take them a while to get those quotes back to you. Depends on how backed up they are, right? Now, not to say it will take a long time. I have had a quote come back same day. I have waited nearly 2 weeks for something before, okay? It certainly varies. That's why it's a good idea to call them. When you submit that quote or you call them to provide the quote, ask them what their current turnaround time is. It's going to give you a much better idea of how long you are going to be waiting for that quote. Now, I would advise the group leader that it's going to take up to 10 business days before they receive the quote from you. Okay, always give yourself this buffer time. It's very important, because you are not in charge of the vendor communication turnaround times. That is up to the vendor. So I would advise 10 business days or 2 weeks to get that back to you. Okay, groups take longer. They're not as fast as our individual clients are. Now, it is very important to know that it's not always fast. Like I said, it can be fast. It can also be incredibly slow. So no matter what the situation is, if you are waiting on something from the group department, always give your client a long period that you expect to hear back, okay? It's much better for you to get back to them in 2 days than to promise them 2 days and get back to them in 10, right? You always want to be realistic. So when you're talking to the group department, when you're waiting for a quote, when you're waiting for an update to a quote or a contract, it can take longer than you expect. So make sure you are giving yourself plenty of time so that you meet the client's expectations. Now, step number 3, you've received the quote, okay, the vendor sent it to you. Now you've got to understand it. This is so important. When you receive the quote, I recommend you read it fully from start to finish, the whole thing, even the terms and conditions, several times. If it were me, I would print it out, put it here on my desk, and as I'm going through it, anything that doesn't make 100% sense to me, I'm going to mark it, I'm going to circle it, I'm going to put a star there, okay, and I'm going to go through the quote at least 2 times and mark those things that I'm not certain about, okay? Write down any questions you have. What is it that you don't fully understand? What is it that doesn't make sense? What is it that you need to clarify? Write all of these things down. You have got to understand this quote 100%, because if your client has a question about the quote when you send it to them, you've got to be able to answer that, right? Otherwise, you've got to call the group department and get an answer from them, and it's more steps and more work for you. Much better to understand it from the get-go. Now you're going to call the vendor's group department and you're going to get your questions addressed, okay? You're going to ask all your questions, all your things that you need clarified. You're going to call them and do this over the phone, and make sure you are taking notes as you do this. Now, you need to take advantage of the group department, okay? The group department is not your typical customer service at a vendor. The group department, this is what they do all day, every day, is contracted groups. So they're there to support you. They're there to answer your questions. You are going to learn from them because they do this so much. They're going to have insight for you, and you're going to learn a lot of things by talking to them. They are a resource there for you, and you need to take advantage of it. That is how you're going to be most successful as a travel agent with a contracted group. So make sure you take advantage of this resource. It is invaluable to you. Now that you understand your quote, you need to send it to the group leader. But before you do this, you want to rebrand the quote with your information and your business's branding. So put your logo on it, put your business name, put your name, your contact information, rebrand that quote. This is part of the reason you want to give yourself enough time too, because rebranding your quote could take a little bit of time. You may be copy and pasting things from the quote over to another document. It's something that may not be the fastest the first time you do it. So consider this when you give your client a time frame. You really ought to rebrand the quote with your information before you send it to the client. Now, schedule a time to meet with the group leader to go over the quote together. I would recommend doing this on Zoom. If your client is able to do it on Zoom, that's going to be the best way. You can share your screen, share the quote with them, go through it and give them the highlights and answer any questions they have as you go through. That's what I strongly recommend. Now, you do need to meet with the client, the group leader, regardless. Even if it's not over Zoom, you should call them and walk through that quote together. Now, give them a few days. They're going to have to look at the options. They may have other group members that they need to bounce this off of. They need to discuss this with before they make their choice, especially if they got 2 quotes, right? If they narrowed it down to 2 options, it may be a little bit of time for them to choose between the 2. So schedule a follow-up, usually a couple of days after you originally met with them to review the quote. Schedule that time to follow up and give them time to review it, okay? Call them on the phone. Did you make your choice? Are you happy with this option? Sometimes you may have to have a new group quote created from the vendor because what they got back is just not going to work for them. That may happen, and that's okay. But make sure you are following up with them on their selections. So thank you so much. This was our process to get our group contract quote. Okay, we talked specifically about the quote in this video, and I will see you in part 4.